go Matthew chapter 21 and verse 2 once again. Ready, go. Saying to them, going to the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. To begin with, let us find out the background of the passage today. Especially today's passage is a well-known story as Jesus' triumphal entry. The triumphal entry. Can you say it together? The triumphal entry. One more time. The triumphal entry. For example, let us read Matthew chapter 21 and verse 1. Ready, go. Now when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage, to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus said to his disciples. At the time Jesus went back to Jerusalem from Jericho with his disciples. And Jesus arrived in Bethphage on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives. Especially, we should remember this place. So why did Jesus arrive at the Mount of Olives? Especially this place, the Mount of Olives, was where God's glory left from the Israelites in Old Testament. For example, let us read book of Ezekiel chapter 11 and verse 23. Ready, go. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain that is on the east side of the city. Unfortunately, God departed his glory from the Israelites at the Mount of Olives because of their sinfulness. It was God's final step in the judgment. God removed his glory because of their sinfulness. It was the same place, the Mount of Olives, where Jesus arrived in the Mount of Olives in the passage today. Especially Jesus came back to this Mount Olive in order to rebuild and return God's glory. Can you say it together? Rebuild and return God's glory. Yeah, Jesus came back to the Mount of Olives in order to rebuild and return God's glory to his people. In other words, Jesus came to this Mount of Olives once again in order to save his people. It was God's plan for Jesus. Yeah, Jesus had to pass by the Mount of Olives before entering Jerusalem. Especially, Jesus commanded his disciples at the Mount of Olives. So what is the command of Jesus? Let us read Matthew chapter 21 and verse 1 and verse 2. Ready, go. Now when they drew near to Jerusalem and came to Bethphage to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus said to disciples, saying to them, going to the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. Yes, Jesus commanded his disciples to find and bring the donkey and colt to Jesus. In other words, Jesus was looking for animals before enter Jerusalem. Especially, we should first understand the custom of the ancient world. To be specific, at that time, when the king and the significant people entered the town, there was a Roman law called Angaria. The law of Angaria, it was transportation law for specific people with animals. In other words, the law of Evangelion allows the imprisonment of animals. Therefore, people need to prepare the animal for transportation for the specific people. For example, people usually prepare the horse to ride the king and other significant people into town. Therefore, people welcomed them who took the horse to enter their town. It was an ordinary custom. Therefore, people were assured that Jesus would ride a horse to enter Jerusalem. At the time, people welcomed Jesus as their king, the king who was a Messiah. They strongly believed that Jesus was a king who had the power and the authority. So they were assured that Jesus would be their conqueror to save them. That's why people were excited to welcome Jesus into town, into Jerusalem. Therefore, as you remember the clip in the beginning today, people were celebrating and welcoming Jesus who entered Jerusalem. However, people might be surprised about Jesus. In other words, Jesus did not ride a horse, but rather he chose a donkey. He chose a donkey in order to enter Jerusalem. Therefore, we should ask this question to ourselves. So why did Jesus ride a donkey instead of the horse? First of all, Jesus rode the donkey in order to accomplish God's promise. Can you say it together? Ready, go? Jesus rode the donkey in order to accomplish God's promise. To be specific, God promised one prophecy through the prophet Zechariah before. For example, let us read the book of Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 9. Ready, go? Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion, shout aloud, daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and have salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Donkey. At the time, God promised a Messiah who will come riding the donkey. It was God's promise for salvation. That's why Jesus accomplished God's promise, since he took the donkey instead of the horse. Jesus fulfilled God's promise through preparing the donkey. That's why when people welcome Jesus, they praise God. For example, let us read Matthew chapter 21 and verse 9. Ready, go. And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. Yes, they praise Jesus as Hosanna. Since Hosanna refers to save us. Can you say it together? Save us. Likewise, they welcome Jesus who was their Savior. Therefore, Jesus kept God's promise through riding the donkey. In other words, Jesus wanted to prove God's promise. That's why Jesus asked his disciples to find and bring the donkey and the colt. At the time, a colt was always beside their parents, who was a donkey. Therefore, Matthew mentioned two animals, both donkey and colt. So Jesus wanted to encourage people who welcome him, since God kept his promise through his actions, riding the donkey. And secondly, Jesus chose a donkey in order to give his peace. Can you read it together? Ready, go?
Jesus chose a donkey in order to give his peace.
Yeah, Jesus did not come to the world as a king who had the power and authority with the passive way. In other words, Jesus came to the world in order to give his peace to his people who are fearful. For example, let us read Book of John chapter 14 and verse 27. We can find the purpose of Jesus. Radical. Peace I leave with you. My peace give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. At that time, Jesus encouraged his people not to be afraid, since he came to give his peace to his people. In Hebrew tongue, it was called shalom. Can you say in your neighbor shalom? One more time? Shalom. Especially the animal of donkey refers to peace, since people did not ride donkeys in the world. Also, the donkey embodies actual humility. Therefore, people remember the donkey as a symbol of peace. As a symbol of peace. In the same way, Jesus also came to give his peace to other people. Also, Jesus became a peacemaker to other people as well. That's why Jesus chose a donkey to reflect his peace. Therefore, Jesus decided to ride the donkey in order to accomplish God's promise and give his peace. That's why Jesus mentioned the reason why he chose a donkey once again. For example, let us read Matthew chapter 21 and verse 3. Radical. If anyone says anything to you, you should say, the Lord needs them and he will send them at once. So what is the reason? Yes, Jesus needed the donkey. Can you say together, the Lord needs them? One more time? The Lord needs them. Yeah, Jesus needs the donkey. Especially when Matthew used the word Lord, he used Greek term kyrios. It refers to God's power and authority. In other words, God, Jesus, needs the donkey through his power. In other words, Jesus chose a donkey in order to use them. That's why Jesus needs the donkey, not the horse. As I mentioned earlier, if Jesus chose the horse, it did not match according to God's promise. Therefore, Jesus only needed the donkey, nothing else. Jesus wanted to use the donkey, an ordinary animal, for God's glory. No matter how weak or ordinary an animal donkey was, Jesus decided to use a donkey according to God's plan. So today, we meditate on Jesus' triumphal entry story. Yes, Jesus chose a donkey in order to enter Jerusalem. Therefore, we can find the reason why the donkey matters through this passage. However, this story did not end yet, since it still matters to us. First of all, peace be with you. Can you say together?
Peace be with you.
Peace be with you. As Jesus rode the donkey in order to give his peace to his people, Jesus also gives his peace in our lives. In other words, Jesus came to this world in order to give his peace to us who are struggling with our troubles. To be specific, as I mentioned earlier, Jesus appeared on the Mount of Olives in order to reveal God's glory and enter Jerusalem with donkey. Jesus came to give his peace for us. Especially, we should remember the identity of Jesus once again. Who is Jesus? For example, let us read the book of Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6. Ready, go. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Prince of Peace. At the time, the prophet Isaiah proclaimed God's promise about the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who is the Prince of Peace. Can you say together? Prince of Peace. Therefore, Jesus came to give his peace to his people. That's why we can find many examples when Jesus encouraged others who are fearful. For example, let us read book of Mark chapter 4 and verse 39. Ready, go. And he woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace be still. And the wind ceased, and there was great calm. At that time, Jesus encouraged his disciples who were fearful of the storm. Therefore, Jesus proclaimed his peace to the sea and his people. Peace be still. Likewise, Jesus wanted to give his peace to his disciples who were fearful. In the same way, Jesus decided to enter Jerusalem to give his peace at last. That's why Jesus chose a donkey in order to accomplish God's plan. Therefore, we should also remember who gives his peace to us when we are struggling with our trouble, when we see the donkey in the passage today. For example, Annie Flint, she mentioned peace in her poem called I Look Not Back. Can you read it together? Ready, go. But I look up into the face of Jesus, for there my heart can rest. My fears are still, and there is joy and love and life for darkness, and perfect peace, and every hope fulfilled. Perfect peace. Likewise, she decided to look to Jesus, who gives his perfect peace. In the same way, we should continue to look to Jesus, who gives his perfect peace to us. Peace be with you. And secondly, we are like donkeys. Can you say it together? We are like donkeys. When Jesus commands people to find and bring the donkey, people might not understand Jesus. For me, if I were Jesus, I might take the horse in order to show myself, show my power. However, Jesus chose a donkey for a purpose. So let us read Matthew chapter 21 and verse 3 with NLT version once again, New Living Transition. Ready, go. If anyone asks what you are doing, just say the Lord needs them, and he will immediately let you take them. Yes, people might not understand their doing. Nevertheless, Jesus only needs the donkey for his people, for his purpose. In other words, Jesus chose a donkey for his great works. To be specific, Jesus chose the ordinary animal, the donkey, in order to accomplish the extraordinary works, the salvation of his people. Yeah, Jesus only needed the donkey who was an ordinary animal, but for a purpose. Therefore, Jesus entered Jerusalem and took the cross to save his people. That's why Jesus chose the donkey in order to accomplish God's plan. In the same way, we are like donkeys. In other words, we are ordinary people. Of course, we have different backgrounds, jobs, talents, and callings. However, think about our lives. We are just ordinary people in the eyes of God. In other words, we are ordinary people of God since we are still sinners. However, as Jesus chose a donkey, God also chose us. God also chose us for his purpose. In other words, God chose us in order to accomplish God's great works, in our lives. Therefore, God needs us. God needs us for His great works. God needs you for His great works. In other words, God will use us for ordinary or extraordinary work of God. Therefore, God will use us for His glory. Especially while I was meditating and preparing the sermon, I remember our church vision statement once again. Can we go together? Ready, go? God does extraordinary work through ordinary people of God. Yes, we are small and weak, but God will use us for His extraordinary works. For example, I want to share my story. Last week, I saw one post on Facebook, and one of my pastors from Japan, she posted this on her Facebook. She said that my reminder every Wednesday 6 a.m. early morning prayer meeting. Yeah, she followed our church YouTube channel and she joined our prayer meeting in Japan. Yes, I was surprised and gave thanks to God. Even though we are small and we are just ordinary church, God used our prayer meeting for other people. The reason why I share my story is because God also needs you. God also needs you. In other words, God will use you who are like donkey, who are ordinary people of God. Therefore, let us continue to keep up the good work for God's glory. Let us continue to keep up the good work for God's glory. Furthermore, we can find the reason why God chose us through Jesus. For example, let us read John chapter 15 and verse 16. Ready, go? You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, He may give to you. At the time, Jesus encouraged His people to bear fruit as their calling. In the same way, no matter how weak we are, no matter how we are ordinary people, we have one calling. Yes, we should bear fruit through us. God will use us for His glory. God will use us not just for success or prosperity, but to bear fruit for His glory. Therefore, let us continue to bear fruit in our lives. Let us remember our identity as a donkey, since we are just ordinary people of God. However, let us remember that God will use us. God will use us for His glory. That's why the donkey matters not only to Jesus, but it also matters to us. The donkey matters to us. Peace be with you. God does extraordinary work through ordinary people of God. Can we do it together? Right, go? The donkey matters to us. Peace be with you. God does extraordinary work through ordinary people of God.